Hey, welcome back. In the last video, we said that the plot is the reader's journey, which questions they're asking and when they get answered, and whether those answers are the real ones or not. We said that the writer controls which questions the reader is asking at each moment of the story, and that the tension lives in between the gap between the questions and the answers. Today, I want to look at the shape that the tension makes across the whole book, the arc, because the arc isn't just a description of what happens, it's the emotional experience you're designing for your readers. But if this is the first time we're meeting, I'm AKGuile, independent author and publisher. I've got one book finished and another in production, and I'm writing under the pen name AKGuile. And before all of this, I spent my career as a business consultant. So I'm not an expert in writing. I'm not a guru. I'm just a bloke sharing what's working for me as I learn this. So if you're finding something useful here, do me a favor, please like and subscribe and help me grow the overall channel. And with that out of the way, let's look at the arc. When I first started learning about story arcs, I assumed that the arc was the sequence of events, the things that happens, the next thing and the next thing, all the way through till the end of the story. And while that's part of it, the more I got into actual writing, the more I realised the arc is something very different. The arc is the emotional shape. It's the flow of tension, of intrigue, of uncertainty, of that feeling of needing to know what happens next across the entire book. So if somebody asks you to draw the curve for your book, you wouldn't draw a straight line. You draw something with peaks and valleys, and it's probably something that looks a little bit like this. Once I started thinking about it in that way, as a shape I was designing, everything else clicked, because now the question isn't just what happens next in the story. The question is, what do I want the reader to feel at this point, and how do I get them there? Let me walk you through what that looks like for a Greymere crime novel. I start off with what I think of as the introduction spike. The reader picks up the book, it opens to the prologue, and something is happening that they don't fully understand. Now, my prologues are designed to grab them and confuse them. Something impacts enough that they need to find out more, but they don't have the context to understand what they've just read. That's its job, the introduction spike, grab and confuse. And then the tension drops, and I'm introducing people, I'm introducing the world, I'm setting up the problem, and the reader's settling in. But the tension is building slowly, steadily, because each scene is raising new questions. And that build continues until the reader is what I think of as a false peak. This is the point where they've accumulated enough information to form a theory. They think they know what's happening, they feel confident, and the tension peaks. Not because something dramatic has happened, but because the reader has committed to a theory, they've committed to an answer. And then I shatter that. New information arrives. The theory collapses, the tension drops, but not as far as it did at the beginning, because the reader is more invested now. They spent time building the theory, getting to know the world, getting to know the characters, and now they need to build a new theory. And from there, the tension builds again, high this time, to what I call the peak. This is where the reader starts to get all the information they need, and they can begin pulling it all together. The full weight of the problem lands, but they don't know how it's going to resolve. And if I've done a good enough job in the opening of confusing them, the prologue connects. The reader suddenly understands what that opening scene was all about, and it has changed absolutely everything. And from there, the tension dips again before building back up to the climax, where everything comes together and resolves. The story's central question gets answered, the confrontation happens, justice, well, Greymere justice in my case, is finally served. And then I wind the tension down, the reader can breathe. Except I choose to pull it back up again, one more time. The series spike, something new surfaces. Something that tells the reader the story they've just read is part of something bigger. And now they need to know. They need to go look at the next book. So that's the arc. It's not the events, it's the emotional shape the events create. Introduction spike, false peak, the climax, the series spike. 5 key moments in a flow of tension that I'm designing for the reader. Now, this is not unique and it's not my own invention. The writing world has used this forever. It was just new to me. But it uses terms like midpoint reversal, pinch point, inciting incident. And I had heard those terms before, but they didn't mean anything to me. I've not done a formal course. I've not studied craft in any formal way. I was just trying to figure out how to write a book that worked. And the terminology felt like a barrier to me. Not because it's bad terminology, I didn't have the context to understand what they were describing. And it wasn't until I worked through the emotional shape myself for one of my books, Just by thinking about what I wanted the reader to feel at each stage, then the terms suddenly made sense. And they're describing something that's actually quite intuitive once you've felt it. I just needed to arrive there in my own way. And I think that's a genuine benefit of doing a writing course if you can afford to do one and have the time and have the money that I didn't. But you'll get all of those terms with all of the context around them, which is something I had to find out on my own. So if you're like me and you're self-learning, let me translate what I've just walked through into the writer's speak. Now, the introduction spike, that's inciting incident, the event that disrupts the status quo and pulls the leader in. The drop after it, where I'm introducing people and the world, that's called the exposition. The reader is being given the information they need to care about what comes next. The false peak, where the reader thinks they've got it all figured out, that's the pinch point. The moment the tension pinches, tightens, and it's about to redirect. The drop after that, the false peak, where the 30 collapses and new information takes a reader in a different direction, that's the reversal. The peak, where the full weight of the problem lands and the story turns, that's the midpoint reversal. The moment the reader sees the problem in a completely different light. The dip after the midpoint, where the reader has all the information but no resolution, where things feel stuck before the final push, that's the dark moment. And the climax is the climax. Same word, same meaning. The moment of highest consequence where everything resolves. Now the wind down after the climax, where the questions are answered and the reader can breathe, that's the resolution. And the series spike, that's the cliffhanger. The reopening that commits the reader to the next book in the series. It's the same shape, it's the same emotional flow, but now every peak and every valley has a clear name. And those names are useful once you know them. You can research them, you can read about how other writers handle them, and you can have conversations about the craft that now begin to make sense. So we've got the emotional shape and we've got the terminology. Now I want to put some structure underneath it. Now back in video 3, we talked about 3-act structures. 3 acts sandwiched between a prologue and an epilogue. And that's the structural shape of my Grey Mare novels. And when you lay those acts against the emotional curve, each one is suddenly doing a very specific job. Now the prologue contains the inciting incident. It's short, a few pages, maybe a chapter. It's done one job and gets out, grab and confuse. Act 1 runs the exposition through to the pinch point. The reader meets the characters, they settle into the world, and the tension builds as questions accumulate. Act 1 ends when the pinch point hits. The reader has formed their theory and I'm about to shatter it. Act 2 is the longest by a clear margin, and it runs from the pinch point through to the dark moment, through the reversal, up to the midpoint reversal, and down into the dark moment. This is where the real work happens in the book. The investigation deepens, the misdirection lands, the story turns at the midpoint, and the reader sits in the dark moment with all the information but no resolution. Act 2 carries the weight of the book. Act 3 runs from that dark moment through to the resolution, the final push. Tension builds from the dark moment to the climax where everything comes together, then drops into the resolution where questions are answered and the reader can finally breathe. Act 3 tends to move faster than the other acts because momentum is carrying it and building all the time. And the epilogue is the cliffhanger. Short, sharp, functional. It reopens the stories for the future series. Now, if you look at the proportional weight of those different areas, Act 2 is roughly half the book. Act 1 and Act 3 are roughly a quarter each, with Act 1 being maybe slightly longer because setup needs a bit more room than resolution, and the prologue and the epilogue are bookends, short and purposeful. The acts serve the arc. They're the structural containers that let me control the emotional shape, and the terminology that describes them is just shorthand for something that's common sense once you can see the shape it's actually referring to. Now, in video 4, we said that the plot is the reader's journey, a sequence of questions that shift across the book. Who, what, why, where, when, how. The writer controls which questions the reader is asking at any given moment. Now we know about the arc, I can map those questions against it. Now in the prologue, the what question is dominating. What just happened? What's going on here? There's a bit of who is the person, who did this happen to, but it's secondary. The reader is confused by design. What is doing incredibly heavy lifting during that prologue area. In Act 1, the focus shifts. Who becomes the dominant question. The reader is meeting the characters. The reader's getting to know them, understanding who these people are. Where is present because I'm building the world. And when is there because the reader is getting grounded in the timeline. If you look at what, it drops right down. It's still present, but it's not driving the reader anymore. And why starts to creep in towards the end of Act 1 as the reader begins forming the theories about what's going on here and why. In Act 2, why takes over. Why is this happening? Why was this person targeted? Why did that character do what that character did? Why is the engine of Act 2. When stays strong because the timeline matters. The reader is piecing together when events happened and how they connect. But here's what's interesting. When the midpoint reversal hits and the story turns, what comes back in again? Not as heavily as the prologue, but the reader is suddenly asking, what is really going on here? What have I missed? What is it actually about? The midpoint reversal is fundamentally a what moment, and how starts to creep in towards the end of Act 2 as the reader begins thinking about the resolution and the new theory. In Act 3, how dominates. How do we prove it? How does this resolve? How do we get justice? The other questions are mostly answered by now. How is what's driving the reader to the climax? And in the epilogue, what comes back again with a vengeance? A new what though? What is this bigger thing underneath the story I just read? What happens next? It's the same type of question as the prologue. The reader is hit with something they don't fully understand, but now it's pointing us to the next book, not to the next chapter. Now, I'm still exploring this idea and this thought process, and I don't think it is a hard and fast rule. It's how I'm thinking about it for my Greymere novels, and time will tell as I write more books whether the pattern holds or shifts, but it helps me to understand where I'm focusing. When I'm writing a scene in Act 1, I know it should be answering who and building the world. When I'm writing through the midpoint, I know the reader's why just got shattered and what has come back. That's not a constraint, it's a direction of travel that allows me to keep this emotional flow working. And the other thing I'm noticing is the questions don't sit neatly inside these little boxes I put on the picture here. They overlap, they shift emphasis rather than switching cleanly. Who is fading while why is building? What disappears and then resurfaces? It's a flow, it's not a formula. And you've got to sort of kind of feel your way through that as part of writing the book. So the plot gives you the questions. We covered those in the last video, and the art gives those questions their emotional weight. The acts give you the structure containers to control the shape, and the question distribution shows you what each section of the book is actually trying to do. And the same question, why did this happen, means something very different at the bottom of a valley than it does at the top of a peak. A why question at the beginning of the book, when the reader barely knows the characters, doesn't carry the same weight as a why question at the midpoint when the reader's invested time and built a theory that's just been shattered. And that's what I mean when I say the arc is something that you design. You're not just deciding what happens next, you're deciding how the reader should feel when it happens. Now in the next video I'm going to look at genre, because the emotional shape I've just described is a shape for a Greymere crime novel. A romance has a different shape. A horror has a different shape. The arc doesn't change in principle, it's always an emotional journey, but the emotion driving it shifts when the genre shifts, and that changes what every scene is trying to do. So let me know in the comments, does the idea of the arc as an emotional shape make sense to you? And next time you sit down to watch something or read something, pay attention to where you feel tense and where you feel released, and you'll start to see the shape, and once you can see it, you can't unsee it, but then you can start to build it. So that's it for today. So if you found this useful, please like and subscribe, help me grow the channel. And with that said, I'll see you on the next one. Take care.